I'm Eileen Pollack. I was a student of Jim McPherson when he was teaching at the University of Iowa Creative Writers Workshop. In fact, I was in his first class of students there in 1981, that would have been. He had just gotten there, I think, a semester before I did. He was in pretty rough shape at the time, and of course, I was nervous about being a student. I think that over the next 2 years, everything I learned from Jim, and it was certainly instrumental in my going on to be a writer. I write fiction, creative nonfiction. I teach. I've taught for many years at the University of Michigan in our creative writing MFA program, and much of what I give to my students is some version of what Jim gave to me and to the other writers in my class. That first semester, we really only had one class with Jim, and he was very quiet as an instructor. He didn't say much, so we barely knew him. And unfortunately, he came down with pneumonia right there at the beginning of the term, and he was in the hospital. And I got a call from Connie Brothers, who was the head administrator of the Iowa Writers Workshop. And for whatever reasons, she said to me, Jim McPherson is in the hospital, he has pneumonia, and he doesn't want to stay, he doesn't trust hospitals or doctors. So I'd like you to go over to Mercy Hospital, check him out, take him home, shop for him, cook for him, take care of him, and make sure he gets better. And, of course, that's something you wouldn't do today to a graduate student. But I just thought, okay, fine, I guess. And I went to Mercy Hospital. Jim was still very sick. And, of course, we didn't really know each other. And I checked him out. And I think even just checking him out of that hospital was my first little lesson in, I guess, what we call white privilege today, or what I would have called how Black people are treated differently from white people, because they just assumed that I was the smart, in charge person and talked to me about Jim's care, even though he was standing right there, as if he couldn't possibly understand what they were talking about. I thought that was a little odd, but especially, here's this brilliant man who had won a Pulitzer, MacArthur Award, but they acted as if I were the smart one, and he didn't understand anything complicated. Anyway, I took him home, and he was kind of nervous around me. There were a lot of sort of discomfort because we didn't know each other, and here's this older Black man, younger white woman, in this very intimate setting. He's in his ratty old bathrobe. I was a vegetarian, and I knew I had to cook him meat because he needed to get strong, so I made him chili and meatloaf, and couldn't really taste it because I didn't eat meat, so God knows what it tasted like. But gradually, we kind of started to enjoy each other's company. I started kidding him about what was in his refrigerator. Jim was notorious for having stuff in his refrigerator that went back 10 or 20 years, so I started throwing stuff out. At any rate, he finally got better. He got well enough to come teach again. And when we held our next class, he came in, and I don't think my classmates knew that I had been taking care of him, but he just walked in with this big enamel stew pot that I had left in his house. I had made, I think, chili in it. And he had washed it and cleaned it, and then he put a raw potato and an album by Nina Simone in the pot and put it in front of me. And that was his way of saying, thanks, we're friends, and you should listen to Nina Simone. I'm not sure what the potato was all about. And he was right. Nina Simone was amazing. And that started really our friendship, and my kind of taking care of Jim a little bit, but it was worth it for everything I learned from him. And you see, Jim, as a teacher, really didn't say much in class, right? He was very Zen-like. He would just say something that you had to think about. It was like a koan, that you had to think about to get its meaning sometimes for years. Or he would read your story and say something very cryptic about it that, of course, was the whole answer to what was wrong with it. But mostly you learned from Jim by hanging around with him, by seeing how he took in the world and made something of it. He had a particular vision and of what it meant to be an American. And you would be with him at the Hamburg Inn or just walking down the street or watching TV or some movie, and you would see how Jim processed that against a historical background, against background of his own life, his experience, race and social class, and really American history. I tried to teach him a little bit about gender and gender preference and things that he wasn't so well versed in, but the point was you saw what he did with experience, what was going on just at street level or what was in the news, what was going on politically, and that was the real education and how he turned that into art. That's mostly what I learned from Jim. Just to be clear, so that was in workshop, but Jim also taught what were known as at Iowa as forms classes. So these were more like craft classes or reading classes. They were very informal. The instructor would just come up with a reading list, 8, 10, 12 books that everyone would read and sit around talking about. And most of the instructors didn't prepare very much. They just came up with their list and we'd come in and talk. Jim I think he taught a different forms class every term, and each was very well prepared and each was brilliant, and those he really did teach. I took Jim's forms class, I think every semester I was there. One was literature and the law, one was the American vernacular. It didn't really matter what they were called. They were about American literature, what it meant to be an American writing about the world you lived in. And I had never even thought, I mean, that sounds obvious, right? You're an American, you're right. But it didn't occur to me that I was an American, right? Which was kind of Jim's whole point, right? We think of Americans as white and Christian and male and straight. And if you're not those things, you don't always quite feel as if you are part of the real America. But part of what Jim was thinking about, and trying to get other people to think about, was that no, America was made up of all our stories. African Americans, Jews, Italians, Irish, everybody, right? Native Americans. And that you really did need to think about yourself as an American, and that the vernacular, the language of everyday people, the way Black people really spoke, the way my people, I grew up at a hotel in the Borscht Belt, everybody spoke this kind of Yiddish English mix. That was okay. You could write in that language. That was interesting. It was rich. This was before the word diversity came into widespread use, let alone overuse. And Jim was really talking about diversity, and how the American story is not one of any one group, but that it's all the groups kind of woven together. And I think whatever course he was teaching, that was what he was trying to get across. And it was a very rich and important lesson for all of us to learn. You know, I had never heard of James Allen McPherson before I was accepted to Iowa. And in those days, Iowa was pretty much the only creative writing program you could go to, so that was it. So once I got in and I found out who was teaching there, I thought it might be nice to read some work by the people who would be instructing me. I grew up in a little town in upstate New York. There was no bookstore, so I remember I drove to the next nearest big city, went to the mall, and there were some very commercial bookstore. And lo and behold, I did find a copy of Elbow Room. And it was in paperback already then. And I started reading it almost right there in the store. It was like nothing I'd ever read before. First of all, I hadn't really read much African American literature. There wasn't a whole lot of it out there being published yet to read. But I had certainly never read anything like this. Now, the first thing I noticed was that the stories were incredibly well written, but also they were really different. I couldn't put my finger on what was so different about them right away, and I certainly didn't understand what they were about. So what happened was I read them over and over over the years I studied with Jim, and then in the years after I left, because you really needed, these are stories that you really need to think a lot about, right? Sometimes there's a narrator coming in out of nowhere, sort of posing riddles, and the riddles don't seem to have any answers, and you're not even quite sure what they have to do with the story. But if you know what Jim was on about, you can figure out the stories, okay? There are certain themes that emerge. One is the importance of the imagination, right? That we need to be able to imagine each other's lives, or we can't see other people as fully human, especially if those lives are different than our own. If we're white and someone else is black, or we're black and another person's white, or whatever the difference is across gender, across age, across nationality, race, religion, that you need to be able to project yourself across time and space into another person's consciousness in order to appreciate that person's humanity. The other reason you need imagination is to imagine your own possibilities, right? So if people like you have only been confined to certain roles for all of history, and you want to break out of those roles, how do you do that if nobody has imagined another way to be, right? What does that mean? Another favorite word Jim would use was improvise, right? So what do jazz musicians do? They have a basic feeling for how their craft works, but then within those rules, they improvise. They get up on the stage and they create something new in the moment. And so if people are coming together who never used to come together, if new ways of being are called for, right? You have to improvise. Right in the moment, you have to do something new and hope it works, and hope that the people you're in the scene with, who are on the stage playing with you, will pick up the improvisation and carry it forward. And Jim would try to do this in his real life. There's a wonderful essay he wrote called Umbilicus that I love to teach about the time that, so this is nonfiction now, Jim had been sort of a recluse. He had been beaten up pretty badly by his time in the South. And when he got to Iowa, he needed a long time to kind of get over the trauma. So he protected himself. He stayed at home. And then one day somebody convinced him to get out, go on a journey. He got in his car and he was going to go find the headwaters of the Mississippi. Except if you knew Jim, you knew he never took care of his cars. And he got just a little ways away from Iowa City beyond Cedar Rapids, and the engine light went on. I think the engine caught fire, pulled over, and he was miles from nowhere. And of course, if you're a black man stranded in an almost entirely white rural area, you get scared, right? With good cause. And I think recently, with all these cell phone videos of what happens to black men who are stranded in their cars, they're at the mercy of just about anyone. So two white guys, working class guys, stop in a pickup to see if they can help. And as Jim writes in the essay, all the markers on the truck were that he should be scared, that these were going to be good old boys who'd give him a rough time. There was a gun rack and what have you. And they'd been drinking. And again, if you only stayed in the ways of being that had been handed to you by history, you would say, no thanks, I don't want your help, and just hope they went away. But Jim tried to improvise. He tried to imagine a new way of being between a black man in that situation and two white guys who said they wanted to help, who said they loved the colored, had friends who were colored. And they tried to help by hooking their truck by a rope to Jim's injured car. And with Jim sitting in at the wheel trying to steer it while two wheels were up in the front and only two wheels were in the back. And he tried not to get scared. He tried to see that rope not by its previous connotations as a rope that might be a lynching rope, There had always been cases of black men being dragged behind pickup trucks by ropes, and not in a good way. And he tried to see it as an umbilicus, as a cord giving birth to a new relationship between white and black, except, as he said, if the road had been straight, it might have been fine, but in Iowa, the hills curve, the road curves, and he got scared, and I don't know if he put his foot on the brake or he turned the wheel abruptly, he ended up in the ditch. And the essay goes on from there, but you sort of get, again, the idea of how he turned what happened in everyday life into this larger story about the possibilities for both black and white in America. So, once you know that that's what he's writing about, you come to the stories, which are mostly about people who are who either see each other in the old ways, and that causes problems, or who are trying to use their imagination and improvise and see each other in new ways, and to forge new connections. So even a simple story like Why I Like Country Music, it just seems like there's a very lovely, innocent story about a black man looking back on his days in elementary school in the South and why he loved square dancing, which black kids aren't supposed to like. Black people aren't supposed to like country music because it's the music of rednecks, right? Jim once said if you walk into a bar and you hear yee-haw, you're in trouble if you're a black man. But he said, but it was also the music of the South, and a music that was created in part by black slaves playing the banjo, playing other instruments, right? And so in this story, the man's wife, who's northern born, can't imagine why he as a black person would like country music or like square dancing. But he thinks back to it, well, that's one thing he would share even with white Southerners, is this love for country music. So there are different kinds of connection that Jim would find between people who weren't supposed to be connected. But they are, because they're all Americans. So within that context, I think a lot of the stories in Elbow Room make a lot of sense. And sometimes it's black people who can't see other black people as fully human. In Story of a Scar, there's sort of a well-educated black man who's speaking in a very condescending way to a black woman who seems to be lower class in the waiting room of, I think, a plastic surgeon. She has a scar on her face. And the speaker, the main character, assumes she must have gotten it from some low-life black guy that she was, catting around with. And the true story of how she got the scar is much more complicated. So even within the black community, Jim, I think long before most writers of color, was writing about the divisions of class within the black community, divisions of skin color, of whether you were born in the North or the South. So what he does is very complicated. I think one of the title story, Elbow Room, is really a beautiful, beautiful story about a black woman and a white Midwestern man who marry sort of in the joyous, riotous days of the 60s, when it seems like new relationships can be created and new ways of being. And the narrator both wants them to succeed, I think, and is very skeptical of their ability to succeed. Can they each love each other and create a family that's neither black nor white, but something that encompasses both of the above, right? So Jim wasn't just about a country in which there are a lot of different people and we each can maintain our own identity. I'm white, you're black, and I'll let you live if you let me live, right? And that's somehow diversity. His idea of diversity was that we each take in each other's culture, right? That black people are as much a part of the Western tradition as anyone else, and they just contain everything that is open to one as by being an American. But whites have much to learn. We are made up of Black culture as well, Native American culture, Jewish culture, every kind of culture, so that each of us is sort of a multitude, a diverse multitude within ourselves, right? And is that possible? Can you contain those contradictions without going crazy? And so Elbow Room really is about that. It's an echo, I think, of Jim's very first story. So when Jim was in law school, before he became a writer, he took a writing course from someone I later became friends with, a wonderful man named Alan Lebowitz, who was then teaching creative writing at Harvard. And Alan once told me that Jim, who was very shy, handed in sort of a one-page story. It was a character sketch about the superintendent of the building where Jim was a janitor. Jim worked his way through Harvard Law School as a janitor in a building in Harvard Square. And this supervisor was this bitter old Irish American with a mentally ill wife living in the basement. And the character, who is sort of like Jim, is young and Black and has his whole future before him. He's going to law school, he's writing stories, and he has a white girlfriend. And so that story is largely about the relationship between the Black narrator and his white girlfriend, but in the context of their relationship to this poor white janitor, who the superintendent, who really has had no opportunities in life. And there's a question of whether that interracial love affair can work. And in that story, the trick really is that the main character, when he thinks he has his whole life ahead of him and has all this new opportunity, he can be very generous to his white boss, who in many ways is an awful person. But when he loses the girlfriend, when he's not so sure of his possibilities, then that relationship shuts down and he finds he can't be generous to the superintendent. So those are a lot of the themes that Jim was working with in both Elbow Room and to a certain extent his earlier book, Hue and Cry. There's a favorite passage I have. I should say that here's a story. So Jim came to visit me once when I was living in Ann Arbor, and I took him to Detroit because growing up in the South, he said he had always thought of Detroit as heaven, right? So Blacks in the South would dream of going north to Detroit, where there would be less segregation, less brutal enforcement of Jim Crow and jobs, right, in the auto industry. And so he thought of Detroit as this golden city. Of course, by the time I took Jim there, Detroit was something of a wasteland. I drove him around. We had a great time. I should say one funny story. We went to the Henry Ford Museum, which used to be a Ford auto plant, and Henry Ford filled it with really artifacts of, so every kind of automobile ever made, every kind of washing machine or vacuum cleaner or iron. It's sort of a museum of technology. And there was this wonderful exhibit of Motown. And the museum was fairly empty, so all the docents, who were white ladies of a certain age, were all in one room, and Marvin Gaye was singing, I think, Tell It on the Grapevine, and they were all rehearsing, they were all doing dance moves to Motown, and they were doing a wonderful job. And Jim just cracked up and he said, what would Henry Ford, who of course was a notorious racist and anti-Semite, say to know that his factory had become a museum, and the music that Black workers had invented to pass the time when they were working on the chain gang, not on the chain gang, on what's it called, the production line, was now being, instead of being scorned as the music of Black people, which is Henry Ford hated jazz and any, let alone what he would have thought of Motown, that it was being sort of reified and given dignity in the museum, and that all these white ladies were dancing to it, and that he and I could be there as a Black and a Jew enjoying it, during the day. But anyway, I also took Jim to the new Museum of African American History that had just opened in Detroit. It was largely empty. They didn't have too many exhibits yet, but it was a very impressive building. And we walked in, and there's this gorgeous rotunda, and I think in the floor tiles there are the names of all these prominent African American citizens. And Jim just walked in and burst out crying because he said he could never have imagined that there would be a museum celebrating African American culture and art as an American institution in Detroit. And then we just sat there for about an hour watching black folk come in and look up and start crying. And so, last week when the Museum of African American History opened on the mall, as part of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., I was so sad that Jim hadn't quite lived to see the day, because that would have really made him cry in happiness. And the fact that Robert De Niro read a quotation from Jim, I think it was an essay he wrote for The Atlantic, as part of the official opening ceremonies with Barack Obama and Michelle Obama standing by his side, I think that would have just made Jim's life complete. The part of Jim's anthology I'd like to read is a very similar quote from Elbow Room, from the title story. And Elbow Room is a story about a young man, a young black man, who seems to be burning with rage at probably at how he's been treated, about the state of the world. And he's become very reclusive, but he keeps being visited by religious groups, the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons and all these different Redeemer groups, and they keep knocking at his door and trying to convert him, and he doesn't want to be converted to love and charity or whatever, some traditional form of Christianity. So he puts them off with riddles that are really just designed to frustrate them. And the narrator sort of comes in and in italics makes commentary on what's going on between the main character and these religious groups. And so this is one of the italicized passages. And I think it's the part of the young man that is trying to love and to figure out a way out of his isolation. If one is not too strict in his conjugation of the verb to be, he might wind up with a sense of living in the present. I believe now that love exists at just that point when the first person singular moves into its pluralist state. I am, you are, he is, she is, we are. The saying of it requires a going out of oneself, of breath as well as confidence. Its image is of expansiveness, a taking roundly into and a putting roundly out of oneself. Or perhaps another word should be used, one invented or transported from another context. I am, you are, he is, she is, we be. Or again, perhaps a beat of silence alone could best bear the weight of it. A silence suggesting the burden of subjectivity. I am, you are, he is, she is, they are. Just love that. It's this grammar lesson, but, again, the moving, how do we move from the self to the other? And this is long before that was common discourse in sort of academic circles or liberal circles. And then bringing in the black vernacular as the answer, right? We be, what better expression of community, white or black? Wouldn't it be great if we could all just say, man, we be Americans, That's the American vernacular, right? And that's why I love that passage. I thought I would say something that probably Jim wouldn't have wanted me to talk about when he was alive, but that I've always wanted to talk about, which is what it was like to be with him and witness the racism that daily he had to put up with. I couldn't have taken it for a single day, and yet it was the context of his entire life. So again, the first time I met him, as I said, in the hospital, the way he was treated. But another time, Jim and Rachel, his daughter, when Rachel was young, came to visit me in Cambridge, Massachusetts, such a liberal place. And Rachel's sandals, they were those plastic sandals, jellies, and they were cutting her feet. So we went to buy her shoes, and we could not get anyone to wait on us in a single shoe store in Cambridge because obviously they didn't want to wait. They thought we were a mixed race couple, and they wouldn't wait on us until finally we found an old shoe store run by a Jewish gentleman who was very happy to wait on us. But even he just assumed Jim would want to talk about sports, and to set Jim on ease, because he was a black man, he just started talking basketball, which actually Jim cared very little about, But I said to Jim, how did you stand there? I was ready to just start, swearing in one of the shoe stores and knocking over the displays of shoes and say, somebody come and wait on us. And he said, Eileen, if I let stuff like that bother me, I'd never get through the day. It was hard to explain. I invited him to Michigan to give a talk, and here's this man, again, a full professor, a MacArthur Fellow, a Pulitzer Prize winner. We went to check in to a hotel, and I have to say, the reception clerk was a black woman. She thought Jim was my driver. She told him where to put the suitcases, and when I said, no, this is Professor McPherson, I am not Professor McPherson, this is Professor McPherson, she was mortified. But, she had just assumed he was the driver. I think the best story was there was another university trying to woo Jim away from Iowa. And apparently the head of the English department or whatever took him out to a fancy dinner and kept telling him how he would be better appreciated at this other institution. And they all had a bit much to drink, I think, and at some point this other professor went to get the car, and when he came back, he didn't recognize Jim, the man that he was trying to recruit, with whom he had just had dinner. He thought he was the valet, and he gave Jim the keys to his car. And I said to Jim, what did you do? And he said, I didn't want to embarrass him. I'm not sure, did he park the man's car? I have no idea, but he didn't make a fuss about it. And I just can't tell you how many times things like this happened when I was with Jim, where I wanted to kill somebody on his behalf, and he would just shake his head, and it was just the warp and woof of his everyday life. And yet, despite the way he had grown up, despite the way he was treated on a day-to-day basis, even as an adult, as such a successful person, he went out of his way to be so generous to everyone. No matter your race, no matter your gender, he wanted to create a family, partly a family for his daughter Rachel, but also just a family that he knew he could rely on, that spoke to his ideal of this America where whoever you were part of the conversation, and what you were writing about and thinking about was how we could create a new America where everybody was free to, where you knew who you were, you knew who your ancestors had been, but you also knew that your ancestors were intimately tied to everybody else's ancestors, and that you could all move forward in this way that allowed people to improvise, to become something new. And that was a remarkable gift that he gave to all of us. I should say at a more particular level, he also gave me a lot of what I had to write about. So my first few books, my first stories were all inspired by ideas that Jim gave me that I should write about. And he particularly gave me an idea for my nonfiction book. He said to me, Eileen, I don't remember where I was. I don't remember what book I read it in. But I read about a white woman who lived with Sitting Bull during the last few years of his life, and she tried to be a friend to his people and to help him. And it didn't end well, and I think somebody should find out more about that woman and write a book about her. And I thought, oh, no, not me. I have better things to do. But of course, it nagged at me, and I ended up spending 15 years writing that book. It's called Woman Walking Ahead, In Search of Catherine Weldon and Sitting Bull. And partly it was because it described my relation to Jim in a way, too. So that whole notion of, say, a white person, a well-meaning liberal white person, trying to understand, trying to connect, to do something for another group of people of a different race or religion or ethnicity, you know, it's both very suspect, right? You're appropriating somebody else's history or culture, you're trying to tell somebody else's story, you don't belong, you're Miss Annie, which is the name for a white woman who would say go to Harlem to be part of, you know, the black community. On the other hand, it's a wonderful thing. Who are the exceptional people who cross those lines of race, of nationality, of religion, of gender, and actually try to connect to another culture? And the funny thing is that, you know, that book came out and nothing much happened with it. It's been out of print for 15 years, and all these years later, there's somebody making a big Hollywood movie of it now. And I don't have much to do. I have virtually nothing to do with the movie, but you know, that's Jim too. And you know, in so many ways, he influenced just so many young writers who are now not so young, and we all have writer students of our own that we've passed on Jim's sayings to and his vision. You know, for one man to have had such a huge, quiet but huge influence on American literature is really astonishing. Jim didn't like to talk about himself, but he did at one point give me a copy of a sort of memoir he wrote about his early life. And, you know, there's stuff up on Wikipedia. I've kind of put it together. So, you know, in rough outline, Jim was born in 1943 in Savannah, and I think there were 4 kids in his family. He was, I think, second oldest, something like that. His mother was a maid, and his father was a master electrician. He was the first African American to be designated a master electrician in Georgia, and I know Jim was always really proud of that. He said his father knew so much about electricity that he could improvise with it, and he used to amaze Jim when Jim was little with what electricity could do. Unfortunately, I think he drank, he had, I think, narcolepsy, so he was sometimes in jail because he couldn't carry out whatever job he was supposed to carry out, and I think Jim was very embarrassed for his father. He didn't really understand the forces affecting his father as a black man in the South until much later. And so Jim took a lot of odd jobs as a very young man to help support the family. I know one of them was he was bagging potatoes in a grocery store, which was a metaphor he used often to try to help us understand how to tell how much was too much to put in a story and how much was too little. He made his way through, I think, Morgan State University, and then he finished up his undergraduate degree at Morris Brown. And then Jim went to Harvard Law School, which, you know, very few black people had done. He was one of the first. He was very proud to have benefited from affirmative action because, believe me, he belonged there and he wouldn't have been there without affirmative action. He had never really been on intimate terms with white people. He said that he had some kind of roommate and he saw the guy brush his teeth, and he kind of was surprised at some level that white people had to brush their teeth. He just thought only black people had to brush their teeth, that white people just automatically had these perfect teeth. It's a story he told me once. So he did very well at Harvard Law. He supported himself, as I said, as a janitor while there, and he started to write stories. So he took a class from Alan Lebowitz. And the very first story Jim wrote, Gold Coast, which is a masterpiece. It holds up today, won a prize and was published in the Atlantic Monthly. And from that point on, I think Jim was pretty sure he wasn't going to practice law, that he was going to write, but sort of incorporate his knowledge of the law into his view of American literature. So he went to the University of Iowa, he got his MFA, and he was pretty much off and running as a writer then. Ralph Ellison noticed his work and was very impressed and mentored Jim. Ellison meant a lot to Jim, especially early in his career. And, as they say, the rest is history. So Jim won a Guggenheim. Not only was he the first African-American to win the Pulitzer Prize in literature, he was in the first group of MacArthur Genius awardees. I like to say back when a genius was really a genius, and back when a MacArthur really meant you were a genius. He taught many places before settling down at Iowa, which is where he taught for the rest of his life and where I was fortunate enough to get to know him.